especially of the parables from last week. And in case we didn't get the message last week, in the parable of the two sons, Jesus tells this one again, reminding us that faith means trust in Jesus, in his life, his death, his resurrection, and that salvation is free. And he makes it clear that he is against anyone, he's against the world if they don't accept his message that God accepts us all, everyone, by trust. And again, this faith is not head knowledge, it's heart. It's what we trust. It's not doctrines and what we believe with our minds. It's what does our heart, our soul, our gut tell us about this love that God has for us. And then finally, he's making it clear, I don't judge anyone. Yes, God has made me the judge, but I choose not to judge anyone. I don't judge what is good. I don't judge what is bad. I don't judge anything. And so the world's insistence on judging people by what they do or how they act, no, Jesus says, God's salvation, God's life is totally free. And this message is so important to Jesus that he goes to the cross for it. He dies at the hands of people that refuse his message. He dies, again, every time we don't trust that message of love. It's all about trust. And that's all Jesus wants, is that we trust him. That we trust God. And there's the rub. Because trust is hard. And trusting God can be really hard, especially when it feels like God is absent. And as I was preparing for this message this morning, I'm looking at this text. This is a perfect stewardship text, talking about the vineyard and workers in the vineyard and fruitfulness and all of that kind of piece. And this is the perfect time to do that because we've got our pledges coming in and all this kind of thing. And the thing that kept jumping out me again and again and again about this text is this verse. A landowner planted a vineyard, and then he leased it and went away to another country. So here's my question, is how do we trust God when God seems to be absent? Or God really may be absent. And that's where I come to Lori's song, alone, but not alone. Sometimes it seems to me that God keeps a sufficient distance from us in order to allow us to determine our own fruitfulness or to allow us to make our own mistakes. And though, of course, God is never really absent from us, a mature faith means that we practice our values and our devotion on our own, even when God seems distant. It's like Job. Job says in all his troubles, even if God slay me, I will trust him. It's kind of an in-your-face God statement. But how do we do that? How do we do that? And that's the question that I took to my spiritual director. I see a Benedictine sister at the St. Scholastica Monastery in Duluth about once a month. We need spiritual guidance too. And I see her once a month. And that was my question for her when I met with her. What do I do when I doubt God's presence? What do I do if I even doubt God's existence? And if you've ever had a pastor that has said, I've never had that kind of doubt, they're lying to you, because we are baptized children of God too. We are human beings too, and we have the same doubts you have. What if I even doubt God exists at all? And it wakes me up in the middle of the night, shaking in terror, and I can't go to sleep. What do I do? And she said, what do you do? What do you do? And I said, well, I go to Scripture. I go to the Bible, I open my Bible, and I read until I find something that gives me comfort. And then I take that word or phrase or whatever it is, and I take it back to bed with me, and I repeat it like a mantra until I can get calm enough to fall back asleep again. And then she says, you know, the Protestant faith relies on Scripture. And we Lutherans are real good at that. We're Scripture alone kind of folks. And she said, the Roman Catholics rely on tradition. And both those things are good. But both of us have forgotten a third way, a very important third way, equally important to Scripture and tradition. And she said, it is your own personal experience of God's presence in your life. We can remember and trust that experience in our lives when we wonder whether God, like the landowner in Jesus' parable, is gone, is absent. And so I started to think back on my experiences of God in my life. And I want to share with you 3, because the reason I want to share them with you is so that you can start thinking about those experiences in your own life if you haven't already. Because they are powerful and they will give you reassurance that God is and that God is present and that you might be alone, but you're not alone. First one, I was in 6th grade. My dad was stationed at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska. And it was a Saturday afternoon, and I am in the living room doing my Saturday chores, which is dusting furniture. And the television was on, and it was kind of in the background. And, you know, in the 60s, we're in this time of fear of communism and what's that going to do. And in the background, which started to draw my attention more and more, was this atheist communist having a conversation about Christians' belief in God, and that belief is the opiate of the people. Remember that statement? We just made up God to ease our terrors and our fears of death. But the reality is there is no God. And when we die, we're gone. We're dead. There's nothing. And this stuck in my head. And I started thinking about that. And I started getting really, really scared. Because what if, when I die, there is nothing? And I lived with that fear for a year. By that time, I'm in 7th grade. We're now stationed back in Fort Meade, Maryland. And it finally has become so awful for me that I went to my mother and I told my mother about this. And she said, my very wise mother, she said, why don't you go talk to your favorite chaplain? And so I called up my favorite chaplain, who happened to be Baptist. And you go, uh-oh. And I called him up and I said, can I come talk to you about God? I mean, now picture this. 7th grade student calling up a pastor and saying, can I come talk to you about God? I mean, it's like our dream come true, right? So, of course, this gracious chaplain said, of course, and we set up a time. My mom dropped me off, and here is this presence of God. This man was very gracious, sat down, listened to me, listened to my fears, and then he said, I don't even remember all he said, but I do remember he was talking about God's creation and how the center, the focus, the purpose, the drive of the universe is love. Look at everything. I mean, this is in the 60s. Think of how much we've learned about creation since then and learned about the universe. That the driving force is love, and God is love. And you look at creation. This was fall, of course, at the time. I remember this, and the leaves were brilliant. And And I think, wow, and he talks about every songbird that sings to you of the love of God. Every leaf that explodes in color shows you this love of God, this joy, this delight that God has in creating and in you. He probably said a whole lot more. But then he said, you want to pray? Oh, yeah, okay. And we sat there and he took my hands and I felt life and love. And it was like this surge coming through from his hands to mine. And we prayed. He prayed. And I left there convinced that God is. And that God is love. And I wanted everyone to know this love that I had just discovered. First story. Fast forward, maybe 2003-ish or so. I'm a pastor. Go on my first trip to Honduras. This trip to Honduras, I was convinced I should not be on. But Kathy Peterson from the Synod office kept calling, Cheryl, you need to go on this trip. You need to go on this trip. I said, Kathy, I barely know the difference between a straight edge and a Phillips screwdriver. I'm totally useless on this trip. We're building a compound for women who are coming out of abusive relationships and trying to establish themselves and their families. I said, I will be useless on this trip. Cheryl, you need to go on this trip. I know you need to go on this trip. And you could be a gopher, you could be anything, but I know you need to go on this trip. I said, okay, Kathy, I mean, like I said, I'm going to be, useless on this trip. I'll try and be a gopher. Okay. So I go on this trip to Honduras. Part of what we did, this particular group that went, was we visited a hospital. And I'm wandering around this hospital, and I come to a room that has 3 or 4 cribs in it with babies of various ages in them. And there's a family sitting with one. And then there's a little 6-month-old baby sitting or lying in another crib. And he's all alone, no parents with him, nothing. And he's just laying there. And I was able to find out that this baby was an orphan. His mother had just been killed in the violence that was going on in Honduras. They did not know who his father was, if he had a father, could not track him down. This baby was alone. And so I asked, can I hold this baby for a half hour? I didn't know what else to do with myself the half hour that I was there. And they said, sure. The nurses said, fine, you can hold that baby. So I went and I sat with that baby. And he played with my keys, and I started singing him the songs that I sang to my daughter when she was that age. In English, he didn't understand, but I mean, that's okay. And I sat with him for half an hour, and then it was time for us to leave. And I put the baby back in the crib, and he started to scream. And I had to leave there with this baby's cries echoing in my head, and it tore my heart apart. We got back to the compound where we were working, and I was so heartbroken thinking about, did I do more damage sitting for half an hour with this baby than if I would have left him alone in that crib? And so I took my Bible, my little pocket Bible, and I took my jug of water, and I headed out to the middle of the cornfield in this compound where there was a tree and also kind of a little hammock sitting piece and a trunk that, a stump that you could put your water on. And I sat there and I thought about this, and I was reading my Bible, and I thought about my father. My father was stationed in Thailand during the Vietnam War. And during his stay there, he was there for about a year. He visited an orphanage and befriended a 5-year-old boy, orphan boy. And during his time there, he got very close to that little boy to the point where he had conversations with my mother about, I really want to adopt this little boy and bring him home. How do you think the girls, myself and my sister, how do you think they'll respond to that? There were a lot of conversations about that. They were all ready to start the whole red tape business of adopting this orphan boy, and the orphanage was bombed, and there were no survivors. And as I sat in Honduras thinking, I spent only a half hour with this little orphan baby, and my dad had almost a year with a 5-year-old boy that he wanted to bring home that died. And I thought about my dad's broken heart. How much more intense that must have been for him than what I was feeling. And all of a sudden, this wind came up. In Honduras, the time that I was there, there was no breeze during the day. It came during the night when it cooled off a little bit. But this wind came up, and it was circling around me, and it was blowing up all the corn husks, and it knocked my little Bible off the stump, and it knocked my bottle off the stump, and it's blowing, and just when I'm thinking, oh my gosh, maybe I should look for shelter, it stopped. And I got back to Minnesota, and I went to speak with my spiritual director about this, and I told her that story, and she said, Cheryl, that was the spirit of your father. Now, I know many of you who have lost loved ones have had some experience of their presence in your life after they have died. I've heard stories from all over from people who have experienced that. And the veil between life and death is very thin. And sometimes we are in those extra thin spaces like I was in Honduras. And I know that's why I was in Honduras, so that I would have that experience. I wasn't in Honduras to help anybody else, but somehow God needed to touch me in that way through the spirit of my father. Third story. I have a labyrinth tattoo on my arm. Some of you have asked me about the labyrinth. This story involves that labyrinth. When I was in Arizona at the Spirit of the Desert Retreat Center, I was there, I was working on my doctoral dissertation, and I had it all set to go. My dissertation was about the specific church that I was serving at the time. And at that time, I was at that retreat center working on that. I realized that it was very possible that I would be leaving that church for another call, which, as it ended up, I did, and moved to Wisconsin. So this was tearing apart my whole dissertation. What was I going to write about? Could I even finish my dissertation? I might have to quit this whole program. Oh my gosh, this isn't going to work, and I feel like I have failed in this, and that I can't get this piece together. And I was struggling with that. And at the Spirit of the Desert, there is a labyrinth out in the desert, made of rocks, and the cactus are there, and you can overlook the mountains. It's a lovely labyrinth. Labyrinths are not like mazes. There is no wrong way to go in a labyrinth. You follow the path, and any of you that can't sit still long, labyrinths are wonderful ways of prayer. You walk in, you follow the path. It will take you to the center, where you stay as long as you want and listen for a message for your heart. And so I walked that labyrinth, and I got to the center, and I stayed there for a while, and very, very clearly, not audible. I mean, if you really truly hear voices, then it's a medical issue. I mean, seriously. But when we hear the voice of God, we hear it in our gut, we hear it in our heart, don't we? And it may come to us in words that we know in our essence are true and come from God. And I got 3 phrases, and the first one was, "You have not failed." The second one was, "I make all things new." And the third one was, "Now, rest in me." I sat there with those words for a little bit, and then I walked out, and a whole new vision and idea for what my dissertation would be about came to me, and I started writing. Which is to say for you, And as I think of these stories, is that God comes to us all in different ways. God comes to us through other people, does God not? I mean, God came to me this morning through Lori's song. You're alone, but you're not alone, as I have struggled in my own spiritual journey of God's presence. Oh my God, I mean, I just can't tell you what shivers that gave me. Even hearing it twice, the second time, same thing. God comes to us through other people, through that Baptist chaplain. Oh my goodness. God comes to us and speaks to us through other people. Or God comes to us in an event that happens, like the wind, where God speaks to us. Or God comes to us in our own heart when we can get quiet enough to listen. Or God comes to us, another story I could tell you about is a dream. God comes to us in dreams. The Bible is full of stories about God coming to people in dreams. As different as everybody is, that's how many different ways there are that God comes to you, to speak to you, to draw you closer to the heart of love, which is God. Scripture, tradition, your own experience. Never, ever discount your own experience. Because even when it seems like the landowner is off in another country, you're not alone. Ever.